there was something else that I did that had a decidedly opposite reaction. And around town, I've sort of acquired a bit of a reputation as an advocate for access. And that mostly stems from a human rights complaint that I lodged in 1993 against Famous Players movie theaters. And I'd like to give you kind of the history so you have the context of how that all went down. I had a big movie goer, an avid film goer. I've been for many, many years. And at that time, the movie distribution was very different. Films were either run in a Famous Players or a Cineplex Odeon theater, rarely both. And even though, to me, that meant at any given time, about half the movies running, I would have to get into my van and drive to the suburbs, thankfully I had that option. See, Famous Players were running 10 theaters in the downtown area, and only one of them, according to their listings, was accessible. So I lived right near a Cineplex Odeon theater. In fact, I bought a condo in a building that was above one, for one of the reasons being that. So I thought, okay, if there's ever a film that I really want to see, I'll make the effort. And that's what happened one Friday afternoon when I went to the Cumberland Cinema. And I asked for a ticket, was sold a ticket for Madame Butterfly, art film by David Cronenberg. The guy looked at me kind of funny. I said, which direction? And he said, well, can you get out of that thing? And I said, well, no, as it happens, I can't get out of this thing. He said, well, you can't go, it's up the escalator. The only movie I could see was Rudy, a football film, which is decidedly not what I was in the mood for. And I said, well, you advertise this entire theater is accessible. That's not us, that's head office, I was told. Take it up with them. So I called, do you realize you're in violation of the Human Rights Code? A recent decision had stated that all public businesses must be accessible. They said, yes, yes, we're looking at all our inaccessible theaters. I said, well, I want to know exactly what you're doing to look at them and what your timeline is. I was told to wait for a letter. 2 weeks later, the letter said that the recent human rights decision was not clear in its implication for theater owners. Right. Well, why don't we make that clear, shall we? So I filed a human rights complaint. There was no reaction from the company, even though I wrote them a letter telling them I had done so, until a reporter from the Toronto Star called up. And within 2 hours, I had the president of Famous Players Canada on the phone, wondering if I would meet with him. Well, long story, a little bit shorter. They did renovate the Cumberland. They promised they were going to renovate the Uptown Cinema, but they reneged on that, and instead they fought the complaint. They fought it for 8 years that it took to wind its way through the system. Now, during those 8 years, 4 other people also launched complaints individually against Famous Players, all with similar horrific stories. One woman who took her grandson to a theater only to have to crawl on her hands and knees up and down the stairs, and all the employees refused to assist her. And when her 4-year-old son, of course, had to go to the bathroom in the middle of the movie, she had to crawl back up and down the stairs again without assistance. Well, we were lumped together, Turnbull et al. Versus Famous Players. And the complaints were heard together. Now, during that 8 years, the landscape also changed dramatically in Toronto. Famous Players opened many larger, accessible venues, and they closed down most of the smaller ones. But for me, the crux of my complaint really centered on the Uptown Theatre, because I was also an avid goer of the Toronto Film Festival. How many people here take that in? That's one of the best times in the city. It's one of my favorite times. I always take time off work, take it in. But every year I was sick and tired of the movies I couldn't see because of the Uptown Theatre, one of the big signature films along with the Eglinton, the beautiful Art Deco Eglinton, which I've never been in because it also wasn't accessible. But anyhow, so they lost the complaint, which was not a surprise. And I would have dropped the complaint if they would have modified the Uptown. I never thought every single venue should be accessible. I wanted choice. But the law does state that every business must be accessible. So in losing the case, Famous Players was given 3 months to come up with a plan of implementation. And as it was, the decision was released on September 11th, 2001. So it was really swept under the rug, the story was, deservedly so. In fact, the only story that was non-9/11 related the next day in the Toronto Star was the one on the human rights decision. So they were given 3 months. 3 months later, they filed their plan of implementation. And even though the media was doing the 3-month anniversary stories, They did pick up on the fact that famous players said they were going to close these theaters rather than modify them. And the media reported that it was going to cost almost $1 million to renovate the Uptown Theater. Of course, what they didn't, the information that they didn't give was that the majority of the $1 million was to gut the interior and update it. Only a small portion was for the elevator. What really took me by surprise was the reaction from the public. It felt like the city of Toronto came down on my head. Now, I was the only public figure, plus it was my name, Turnbull et al., and being a reporter, I guess I became an easy target. But the letters that came into the Toronto Star and the phone calls that I got, people said I should resign in disgrace. I had set the disability rights movement back 10 years. I was denying future generations the historical significance of these theaters. We were doing it for money. Oh, it just went on and on and on.